Hi everyone, and welcome to my continued coverage of the Candidates Tournament 2013. After 6 rounds, both Carlsen and Aronian have stretched out into the lead on 3.5 out of 6 and 1.5 points clear of the rest. They are both playing at a very high level, and the remaining game between them, which could be crucial if it's not a draw, will be played on Sunday. The game I thought we'd look at today is Carlsen's game from round 4 against Grischuk, who's an incredibly strong Russian grandmaster. Carlsen had white and opened with e4. Grischuk answered e5, and after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, we're going into the very well analysed Roy Lopez opening. Grischuk continued with knight f6, which takes the game into the Berlin variations, which Kramnik popularized in his match against Kasparov many moons ago. It's a very solid line and sometimes referred to as the Berlin Wall as a result. Carlsen continued with d3, which is a move that the great world champion Steinitz used to play. Quite simply, it protects the e4 pawn from the knight. And white has other options, such as simply castling, where it's possible to win back the pawn if knight takes e4. These lines with d3 are a little bit more passive, but they're very solid and keep black restrained. Grischuk answered with bishop c5, getting his dark squared bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing d6. And Carlsen answered c3, which is a standard move generally played with the idea of pushing d4 to create a very good pawn center with tempo, although that can't be done before the e4 pawn is defended somehow from the knight, or at least it's not wise to do it until e4 is defended. So both sides now castled, and Grischuk played d6. So both players have developed logically, getting their king's bishops into play before playing d6 and d3 respectively. And these lines with d3, they're a lot less explosive than some of the other lines, and white is playing for a patient build-up and slowly gaining a positional edge, which is often how Carlsen plays. Here he continued with g3, and again this is a standard move in this opening. The idea, of course, is simply to prevent bishop g4, which would be a logical square for the bishop and an annoying pin to deal with for white unless he wants to create kingside weaknesses. It does create a middle game target here on h3. This pawn, sacks on h3 can happen, they're reasonably common, but as long as white keeps that in mind, he should be fine. So Grischuk can now put the question to the bishop with a6, and Carlsen exchanged with the bishop takes c6, and then came b takes c6. So white has not only lost the tempo, but given up the bishop pair, of course. And Carlsen has very concrete ideas that he's going to follow after electing for this exchange. He's damaged the black pawn structure here on the queen side, and it's likely that black is going to play d5 at some point, after which white can hope to use the c5 square, because it will be permanently weakened then from black's point of view. And at the moment the bishop is controlling it, but white can fight to control that square and then try and use it. And then he can also attack the doubled pawns of black, of course. So Carlsen continued now with the rook e1, which will allow a later d4 push, although it's debatable whether white actually wants to do this, as it's slightly weakening on the light squares, and as a general rule white should be keeping his pawns on the light squares after trading his light square bishop. But of course these general rules can be broken in dynamic fashion if the position dictates that it's logical to do so. I saw an interview with Carlsen a while ago where he was going through a game of his from Wikan-Z, and he mentioned how he wouldn't be happy unless he gets dynamic play in the center, and I thought that was an interesting insight into how he sees and feels about the game. Grischuk continued with rook e8, which discourages this d4 push even further, because the pressure on e4 will be increased after e takes d4 and the knight and the rook bearing down on e4. So Carlsen played knight bd2, and you know, he's seen that Grischuk is pretty much forced to play d5 if he wants any kind of active play, after which he's going to be able to win a tempo on the c5 bishop with knight b3. So play continued with d5, and now e takes d5, and this uncovers a second attacker on the e5 pawn in the rook. So now the knight and the rook are both attacking e5, so this forces Grischuk's answer, queen takes d5, in order to defend. Although, you know, he might have had some compensation for the pawn if he played c takes d5, and after knight takes e5, bishop d6, knight df3, and now c5. In the notorious Marshall Gambit, black gives up his e5 pawn for attacking chances on the king side, and this position is not that dissimilar. So we go back to the game anyway. Queen takes d5 is what was played, and Carlsen continued with knight b3, attacking the bishop. And you know, black doesn't want to give up the bishop pair, and Grischuk elected for bishop f8, keeping the bishop on the a3 to f8 diagonal and giving his king some extra defense. Most club players would have played bishop a7 in order to keep some pressure on the white king, but Grischuk was more prudent with his move bishop f8. So Carlsen continued with c4, so gaining a tempo on the queen. And something that's interesting to note here is Carlsen's weak d3 pawn. And you know, again, many amateurs may have rejected this continuation due to the creation of this weak pawn on an open file, but great players are willing to accept these positional weaknesses in return for dynamic play. So Grischuk moved his queen to d6, which keeps pressure on d3, and Carlsen now got his bishop into the fray with a bishop e3, which is a good active post, and it's hard to dislodge the bishop from there. Another of the benefits of playing h3 is that knight g4 is ruled out, which is a move you always have to consider if you play bishop e3, and there's a knight on f6. Grischuk continued with knight d7, which serves a few different purposes. Firstly, it takes control of the c5 square, which both players had been controlling equally, and in so doing it prevents white from playing c5, which he may have wanted to do. And this move, knight d7, also allows an f5 push, which you know, if black wants to go for that, he can go for f5 and f4, kicking the bishop and gaining space on the king side. And Carlsen now aimed to liquidate his weak d-pawn with d4. And again, many club players might have rejected this continuation, as it could lead to an opening of the board, which in theory is going to favour the bishop pair. However, it's a mistake to try and keep the game completely closed when you have two knights against the bishop pair. Although it's tempting, just on general principles, you have to get good squares for your knights in order to make them active, and this is usually not possible unless you gain space with pawn pushes and exchanges of some kind. In fact, it was Grischuk who kept the game closed now with e4, gaining a tempo on the knight. We can have a look and see what might have happened if he had captured instead. E takes d4, queen takes d4 is best, and white is enjoying a comfortable overall edge of about half a pawn. His pieces are better developed, and although black has the bishop pair, his queenside pawns are very weak, and he'll have to keep a constant eye on them, especially in the endgame. Play might continue c5, queen c3, rook b8, and rook a d1, and white keeps his nagging edge. Okay, so back to the game. Grischuk has just played e4. So Carlsen continued with knight f d2, which puts some pressure on the well advanced e4 pawn. Grischuk continued with a5, which is a double-edged move. He threatens to kick the knight here on b3, which is going to weaken the d4 pawn a little bit, but the further pawns move up the board, the harder they are to defend. And Carlsen answered with a4, which stops the pawn in its tracks and fixes it as a target. So Grischuk now bolstered his e4 pawn with f5, which is a move that will probably have to be played at some point anyway, and logical if he wants to try an attack on the king side. However, it has to be said that White's edge is steadily growing. Grischuk was playing aggressively, but Carlsen's calm positional play is proving to be better. Okay, that's the end of part 1.